What's up, folks? Nate here at Tubal Dyno Works. I am on the dyno today with our 2026 Kawasaki Z1100, and I have just wrapped up our stock intake and exhaust testing and tuning, and the results from our custom ECU mapping for these bikes in 100% bone stock trim are truly hugely transformative. As I already covered in our prior video that we went ahead and posted when we first got this bike broken in and on our dyno, it made about 125 horsepower and just under 79 pound-feet of torque in 100% bone stock trim once we were done breaking it in. The fueling at light throttle is super lean, and the fueling at wide open throttle is unnecessarily rich throughout the entirety of the rev range. Now, when I posted that video a few weeks ago showing those initial results, I did not yet have a bin file definition for these ECUs. We now do, thanks to our friends over at Woolwich Racing, and we've now completed our tuning, as I previously said, for these bikes in stock intake and exhaust trim. And while I was pretty certain we were going to see significant gains at wide open throttle, I am routinely surprised at how screwed up the stock mapping is in these modern Kawasaki ECUs everywhere else besides wide open throttle. Because the dyno graph I'm about to show you and the significant performance improvements we've been able to accomplish at wide open throttle really do not tell you anywhere near the whole story of just how screwed up the mapping is in these bikes from the factory everywhere else besides on the throttle stop. But wide open throttle performance is the easiest thing to show you guys on a dyno, so that's what we're going to start with first. The blue line is how the bike now performs with our custom ECU mapping in place now that we have completely overhauled and unrestricted the throttle-by-wire mapping, completely overhauled the ignition timing advance maps, and corrected the fueling. We've picked up almost 10 horsepower peak to peak, we've picked up almost 6 pound-feet of torque, and out there at 10,000 RPM, you're talking about a nearly 13 horsepower improvement. The bike simply makes more power and torque no matter where you're looking throughout the entirety of the rev range with our custom tuning in place. Now, just seeing those wide open throttle performance improvements alone, our tuning should practically sell itself. But I truly cannot stress this enough, that does not tell anywhere near the whole story with how massively transformed this bike is now that we've gone through all of the ECU mapping. Because not only was the ignition timing really overly retarded at wide open throttle, it was massively too advanced in some areas of the light throttle portions of the mapping, and completely off the charts retarded. I'm not talking about special needs people here, folks. I'm talking about not nearly enough ignition timing advance in some portions of the rev range at high RPM. The fueling everywhere below 60% throttle is set to a fixed 14.7 to 1 AFR, which is super lean and pretty much the standard recipe now for any of these bikes due to modern Euro 5 plus emissions compliance. And there's big throttle-by-wire restrictions in place with some of the worst engine braking mapping I've ever honestly seen on a factory motorcycle. So let's dive into some of that, because that truly is what you're going to feel the vast majority of the time you're riding these bikes, because let's face it, unless you're on a racetrack, which you probably will be at some point if you own one of these bikes, I hope you will be, but the majority of the time, you're not going to be on the throttle stop, which is all that dyno graph shows you. So let's dive right into the mapping here in the stock ECU. Now, I can't really show you what we've done with the fuel maps here, because honestly, I'm not that interested in educating our competition and pointing out the flaws in those maps, because I know that a lot of our competitors watch these tuning videos before they ever dive into these themselves, because honestly, it just gives them a leg up. So I can't really show you anything there, but just know that they're obviously way too rich at wide open throttle, way too lean at part throttle, and all of our custom ECU mapping addresses that. It simply makes more power at wide open throttle with the slightly leaner fuel mapping. Again, I'm not going to give away our specific AFR target, and they run so much smoother without the fueling being at 14.7 to 1 in closed loop with the stock mapping in place. What I can dive into, and what we'll cover next here, is the ignition timing advance. In any mode, whether it's full power or low power, you have the same fundamental issue here with the ignition timing advance maps on these bikes. When we're seeing ignition timing advance at light throttle somewhere here in like the 30 to 40 range, that is relatively normal. However, to create a nice crispy lean burn for emissions compliance, or crispy hot burn I should say for emissions compliance, we've got values here up into the 50s, which on this particular inline 4 engine is a little too hot. That's burning it nice and clean for emissions compliance, but that's not great when you're talking about throttle response or outright performance and cylinder temperatures. Now, down here at the higher end portion of the rev range, so above about, say, 5,400 RPM, all of a sudden these values at light throttle go way lower. You're talking like in the 20s to all the way down to like 17.4 degrees of advance. But then that is only at the very light throttle portion of the mapping there. You can see that's like the first 10%. By the time you're back into like, say, the 10, 12, 15% range, all of a sudden timing's back to a more reasonable value, somewhere here in the 30s. This giant timing retard is Kawasaki's way of trying to fix their god-awful throttle-by-wire mapping, because when you pull that much timing out at light throttle, it does soften the initial throttle input. But this is a really stupid way to go about doing that, because you can simply better manipulate the throttle-by-wire mapping and leave much more reasonable ignition timing values in there to create an even smoother throttle response. And I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about here when we flip over to the throttle-by-wire mapping. Before I show you the raw numbers, I just want to make sure everybody understands how these throttle-by-wire systems work. I've covered this 1,000 times in other videos. Not 1,000 times. Hundreds of times in other videos. But on any modern throttle-by-wire system, the throttle-by-wire tables work like this. You have, obviously, your throttle, but no mechanical connection to the throttle plates when you are twisting the grip. So the ECU mapping is giving you essentially a percentage of your requested throttle, which is what you're actually asking the bike to do with your wrist, compared to how far it's actually opening the throttle plates on the throttle body. So just because you're asking it for full throttle does not necessarily mean you're getting full throttle. Likewise, if you say you're only asking for 5% throttle, you're almost never actually getting just 5% throttle with the mapping in these modern ECUs. So knowing that, I hope this makes a little bit more sense now that you can look at it. First of all, in every single gear, whether you're first, second, third, fourth, fifth, or sixth, the throttle-by-wire mapping on these bikes is the same. Fine, whatever, no big deal. Now, on the y-axis here, we have engine RPM. On the x-axis, we have the percentage of requested throttle that you're asking for. So you're asking for 0.5%, 0.8, 1.3, 10, 20, etc., etc. And these numbers here represent the percentage of what you're asking for. So say if you're asking for 12% throttle, you're only getting 41% of that requested throttle, which is like what? 4 or 5%? You're getting 46%, 47%, 47%, etc. at these individual portions of the rev range. Now, the way this works is that right here at light throttle, right as you crack the throttle, they're giving you 100% of what you're asking for. So you're getting that 0.5 or 0.8 or 1.3 or 1.8% throttle opening in these portions of the rev range here. But then they all of a sudden start slowing down how much of the throttle they're giving you right after about 1.8 or 2%. So by the time you're requesting 4% throttle as you're rolling on the gas, you're actually only getting 76% of that. By the time you're asking for 5.6, you're getting somewhere around like 60 or 70% of that. And then less, and then less, and then less, and then less. And then finally, all the way out here at like 28% throttle, you finally start getting more and more and more of what you're actually requesting. And then you can see way out here at wide open throttle, well, you're not getting wide open throttle anywhere until, let's see, what is this specific value there? 5,500 RPM is where you finally get 100% requested throttle. And at the very top end, they close the throttle-by-wire plates down on you, which is why you get some of those bigger top-end performance improvements when you tune these bikes. So what you ultimately end up feeling is this. That first couple percent throttle feels very immediate and very snatchy, which anybody that's ridden any modern throttle-by-wire bike knows that the OEM throttle feels really, really twitchy. But then the rest of that, say 5% to like 50% throttle, feels pretty soft and subdued, and then when you finally get past that, all of a sudden you're off to the races and really rolling. But that initial snatchy throttle, and then sort of that deadness there because you're getting so much less than what you're requesting, absolutely sucks and does not make you feel very connected to the bike while you're riding it whatsoever. That is by far the single biggest complaint that we get on any modern throttle-by-wire bike, and overhauling these throttle-by-wire tables is what we actually spend more time doing than anything else when we're developing tuning for these bikes, because that's the single most impactful thing that you're going to feel while riding these things. Now, you can listen to me say that, and you can probably experience the initial throttle snatchiness and sort of that deadness there, between like, say, 5% throttle and half throttle that I'm describing to you. but I can actually show you visually much better what that looks like in a 3D representation of the OEM throttle-by-wire mapping, and then a 3D representation of the throttle-by-wire mapping that I've developed for these bikes here at Tool Dyno Works. And hopefully that'll much better allow you to understand exactly the enormous benefit you're going to see in just terms of overall throttle smoothness and response with our custom tuning in place. So this right here is the 3D representation of the throttle-by-wire mapping in full power mode on these bikes. And as you can see, it looks absolutely terrible, if I can find my mouse here. You have this huge valley in the throttle-by-wire curve, which is all of a sudden the throttle-by-wire system just not giving you what you're asking for and making that big dead spot until it finally starts to ramp up and give you something closer to what you're asking for. You don't need to know anything about tuning to know that seeing a giant dip in your throttle-by-wire response curve is not going to feel good. You can also see that the rest of the curve here really is not very linear. It slowly kind of creeps up, but there's big sort of peaks and dips and valleys there, no matter where you look in that curve. It's utter garbage and just what we generally see as sort of the norm now on most modern throttle-by-wire bikes, and especially from Kawasaki. Now again, knowing nothing else other than what I've already shown you here, it does not take any sort of high-level understanding of tuning to know that a throttle curve that looks like that is going to feel much better, where you have a nice smooth and subtle roll-on, so you can start to open the throttle-by-wire system up or request a little bit of throttle cleanly, and then it smoothly ramps up and gives you closer to what you're asking for after the initial, say, 10% throttle or so. Again, you don't need to know anything else other than just basic shape recognition here to know that that's going to feel a hell of a lot smoother than that. Now, Kawasaki knows that your initial throttle response is incredibly important on these bikes. They give you 100% of what you're asking for in the first 4% or so, but then after that, they just neuter it on you. That conceptually makes absolutely no sense, because if anything, you want that first few percent to be very, very soft. You need to be able to slightly roll on the throttle to load up the tire and the chassis, say if you're on a racetrack and you're leaned over, to load up that rear tire. Otherwise, when you start to crack the throttle and all of a sudden it just immediately gives you power, you can oftentimes cause a grip issue with the rear tire and end up on your face. So the reason that they, going back to the ignition timing mapping, have absolutely murdered the timing tables at light throttle in the higher portion of the rev range is to counteract the garbage throttle-by-wire mapping they have in there. Because yes, when you're backing 20 plus degrees of timing out at light throttle, it will create a dramatically slower burn and provide less power when you're slowly opening the throttle plates. But if you actually just build the throttle-by-wire mapping properly and create a proper progressive throttle curve, you can go ahead and crank the timing back in, and the bike just burns fuel so much cleaner. So fundamentally, from an emissions standpoint, murdering that much of the timing table actually just destroys the burn of the actual fuel itself inside the combustion chamber and objectively makes it dirtier. I truly don't understand what the Kawasaki engineers are thinking here, because as I just showed you, you can absolutely create a perfectly buttery smooth throttle-by-wire response with these bikes with proper ECU mapping in the ETV tables while still retaining normal ignition timing values in the ignition tables. Again, I truly don't know why they do it this way. There's got to be a reason for emissions compliance that I'm just not understanding, but fundamentally everything that they do here and that I've just showed you is completely back-asswards, which is why, if you've ever ridden one of these bikes stock, or the new Z900s, or the new Ninja 1100s, or the new Versus 1100s, anything with Kawasaki's latest Euro 5 Plus emissions compliance and nonsense in them, and you've ridden it with our custom ECU mapping in place, you notice the immediate difference of how much smoother yet stronger the bike runs everywhere throughout the entirety of the rev range. Like I said, it's truly a massively transformative difference that I just can't show you here very well on a dyno, which is really only useful for measuring wide open throttle or steady state throttle power. Now, the other fundamental issue that all of the modern Kawasaki's have, and I'm not talking just about the Euro 5 Plus bikes, even some of the Euro 5 bikes back to like the ZX10s, is not the on-throttle portion of the throttle-by-wire mapping, it's the engine braking mapping. When you're at zero, when you've rolled off and you now need the bike to slow down. There's a fundamental problem with the engine braking tables on these bikes that does not really show its head until you go ahead and disable the decel fuel cut that's built into all of these modern ECUs. One of the many things that we adjust in the advanced settings tabs here in WRT is the deceleration fuel cut, we disable the decel fuel cut on pretty much every modern motorcycle, because what happens when you are rolling off the throttle here is that the injectors shut off like a light switch. So you've got a little bit of injector going at light throttle, you let off the gas, and all of a sudden they just shut them off entirely, which makes the whole bike just jerk forward on you. And then part of the other issue here when you try to roll back on the throttle is that all of a sudden the injectors go from off to on again, which creates this big lurch. So disabling the deceleration fuel cut on almost every model out there is almost a necessity to ever resolve the throttle-by-wire on-off twitchiness, along with overhauling the ETV mapping, as we just discussed. The problem with a lot of these Kawasaki's is that when you disable the deceleration fuel cut and take a look at the engine braking tables, well, you can see why they all of a sudden cruise control on you, or just stop decelerating entirely. And here's what I'm talking about. This is the percentage of throttle that remains open when you're rolling off the throttle, because you're not actually ever going back to 0% throttle. The throttle is always staying slightly cracked open, but it's really cracked open here in the higher portions of the rev range. So say like 9,000 RPMs, you roll off the throttle, it's actually still sitting at 7.5%. And it doesn't matter if you're sitting at 7.5% throttle, and there's no fuel going through the system when you're decelerating, because again, the decel fuel cut from the factory is enabled, meaning when you're off the throttle, there's no fuel going through the injectors and out the pipe. The problem is, when you go ahead and disable the decel fuel cut in the software, and all of a sudden there's now fuel in the system, and you still have the throttle plates open at like 7.5% at 9,000 RPM here, the bike just keeps rolling. It doesn't actually decelerate. Now, I cannot even begin to tell you how many other tuners' mappings that I've read out from their unhappy customers' ECUs where the decel fuel cut's disabled on a modern Kawasaki, and the EBC mapping, or KEBC mapping, so Kawasaki engine braking control maps, are completely 100% untouched. And they wonder why when they roll off the throttle the thing just keeps going, or their auto blipper functions like dog shit. I don't understand why other tuners seemingly miss that table all the time, and don't understand how to then appropriately trim the fueling with the decel fuel cut now disabled. That's the whole point, to give us control over the fuel going through the injectors on deceleration, instead of just shutting them off like a light switch. But whatever. Again, try not to educate my competition too much here. My point is that we completely and dramatically overhaul the engine braking tables on these bikes to allow for a massively smoother engine braking than you ever got from the factory while the deceleration fuel cut is disabled. It makes both your off-throttle and on-throttle experience riding this bike massively smoother and more predictable than it ever was from the factory, which is always our whole goal here at Tool Dynaworks, is to make you feel more connected to the bike and what you're requesting it to do with your right wrist. Now, there's also lots of other things that we go ahead and address sort of by default with any bike that we're tuning here, and the Z1100 is no exception. The cooling fan parameters on this bike are set pretty hot. This means that the fans come on at 100 Celsius and they shut off at 95 Celsius. We lower that so they come on closer to about 95 and shut off at 90, because 100 Celsius is just a little bit hot. A lot of tuners go way too low here. Like, this is nearly fighting the mechanical thermostat function in the bike. You really only need to have them come on about 95, which is perfect. So that's where we set them. There is also a top speed limiter in these bikes. It's way up there. You'd only have a time hitting it like in the very top of 6th gear in stock trim. So yes, it's there. Many of you may not realize it, but we do go ahead and disable it. And we also shut off the air injection system and the O2 sensor fault codes, which I'll actually cover much more in depth when we begin our aftermarket exhaust and intake testing and tuning in our coming videos. Now lastly, there's just a couple more things I want to cover here. This bike does have a low power mode that you can access through both the rider modes and is also the default in something like rain mode. I personally can't ever conceptualize when I will ever be using low power mode on this bike, because I pretty much just use it as a track day and weekend toy. But maybe if you're ever caught out in a bad rainstorm, or you're putting somebody that's relatively new to a bike with this much torque, you'd want to put it in low power mode, which, by the way, from the factory is limited to 50% throttle. But the low power mode still has the same garbage initial throttle-by-wire opening maps and the same terrible engine braking maps that full power mode does. So just know that we still retain the low power function in these ECUs. I limit it to 59% instead of 50 just to give you a hair more power, because 50 in low power felt really dead in my testing. But I've still completely overhauled and smoothed out the throttle-by-wire mapping there, so you will still have that nice buttery smooth on-off throttle response in low power mode that you get in full power mode once we flash the ECU for you. And lastly, to wrap up the changes here, because I completely forgot to mention this previously, we do extend the rev limiter just a hair on these bikes. You're only talking a few hundred RPM, but now it'll cut out at only about 10,500 RPM, and there's really no reason to extend it past that, because peak power is occurring all the way back here, and you've got the power curve being as flat as a pancake, so there's really just no reason to keep stretching that out. By the time you're out here, just frickin' shift and grab another gear. Now that we've covered all of that and all the changes we make to the ECUs on these bikes, I really hope that you guys have a better understanding of just how truly transformed these Z1100s are, and any of the modern Kawasaki's are, that we offer tuning support here for at Two Wheel Dyno Works. They truly, again, are not done justice by the already impressive wide open throttle dyno graph that I can show you as far as power and torque improvements are concerned, because they just run and ride so much smoother and cooler and stronger throughout the entirety of the RPM range with our tuning in place. Now, obviously, this level of development, with the stock exhaust and the stock intake still being on the bike, is just our starting point. This is where we get all the throttle-by-wire mapping built, figure out the optimal ignition timing maps for these bikes, etc., etc. We now are going to go ahead and show you guys a number of videos of different aftermarket exhaust and intake modifications for these bikes, because there's still a lot more power to be had, especially by getting rid of this atrocious stock exhaust system. As I've covered in tons of other videos before, and I even alluded to in our very first video for these bikes, this Kawasaki header design is Euro 5 plus compliant garbage with how badly they neck it down here at the front O2 sensor bung there as the head pipes come into this collector, and then open it back up, and then neck it down again, and then actually go into the bread box itself. This design flows like shit. So, there will be huge airflow improvements and therefore performance improvements once we get rid of this whole thing. Now, a lot of people out there will probably want to just start with a slip-on exhaust for these bikes, so I'm going to go ahead and start with a slip-on as well, because there is a joint here at the bread box that you can go ahead and replace just this big cannon of a muffler. And it will provide some very small level of performance improvement because it'll flow just a little bit better than this, but this header design is really the fundamental flow issue here with all of these modern Kawasaki's from a physical standpoint. So a full system is obviously what we're always going to recommend on these bikes to maximize performance. And obviously the different exhaust systems out there from all the different manufacturers and some of the different intake parts that are going to come out for these bikes over time are all going to flow a bit differently, which is why we always go through our intake and exhaust specific testing and tuning process here to make sure that we've got custom ECU mapping built for every combination of every intake component and every exhaust system that becomes available for these bikes over time. Now, obviously these bikes are brand new. A lot of manufacturers are not really certain if older stuff is going to fit, and neither am I. But we're working with some of the US-based manufacturers to figure that out very, very soon, and I should be able to show you guys both slip-ons and full systems for these bikes in the very near future. I can also guarantee that no other tuner on the planet is going to go through anywhere near the level of rigorous intake and exhaust specific testing and tuning that we are going to here at Two Wheel Dyno Works. This is sort of our MO, and what separates us from pretty much every other tuner out there in the motorsports industry is that we actually go through all of the individual intake and exhaust specific testing and tuning. So you're not just getting, say, generic mapping for a slip-on or generic mapping for a full system. You're getting ECU mapping for your specific intake and exhaust combination, which is why I can also guarantee that you're just not going to find higher quality tuning for these bikes anywhere else than right here at Two Wheel Dyno Works. But in the meantime, if you've picked up one of these new 26 Z1100s and you want to get our custom ECU mapping flashed into your ECU, head over to twowheeldynoworks.com, purchase our mail-in ECU flashing service, pop the ECU out of the bike, ship it out to us, and we'll get it flash shipped right back to you the very same day we receive it. We also always offer free ECU mapping updates to all of our customers that purchase our mail-in ECU flashing services for any future modifications that you may make to the bike. So if you want to go ahead and just experience the huge improvements that our tuning provides right now while the bike is stock, or in whatever trim you currently have it in, and then you want to add different intake and exhaust components in the future, don't worry about it. Just send us back the ECU, and we'll update it for you free of charge, obviously minus the cost of shipping. And as always, if you have any questions whatsoever about intakes for these bikes, exhaust systems as they come out, our custom ECU mapping, whatever it is, do not hesitate to email us at support@twowheeldynoworks.com. I'm the guy that personally answers any and all tech support questions every single day we're open here at the shop, and both myself and my staff are always truly happy to help.